The silence in Ethelgard was a commodity more expensive than the vintage wine breathing in crystal decanters or the slivers of truffle artfully scattered across plates of handmade pasta. It was a purchased quiet, a heavy velvet curtain that muffled the city's frantic heartbeat and insulated the patrons from the untidy realities of life. Here wealth was not shouted. It was whispered in the discreet gleam of a platinum watch, the confident posture of old money, and the effortless way one could command the world with a flick of the wrist. Alara moved through this curated silence like a phantom. Her official title was server, but her true function was to be an extension of the restaurant's opulent stillness. She had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill not taught in the hushed halls of the conservatory she once called home. Her steps were soundless on the plush dark carpet. Her hands were steady as she poured Chablis into glasses that cost more than her weekly groceries. Her smile was a polite neutral mask that revealed nothing and invited no conversation. She was a ghost in a crisp white shirt and tailored black trousers, a necessary but unnoticed component of the grand expensive machine. Inside her, however, a symphony raged. While her body executed the precise choreography of high-end service, her mind was a tempest of music. She deconstructed the ambient noise of the dining room into its component parts. The rhythmic clinking of silverware against porcelain became a complex percussive line in 7/8 time. The low murmur of conversation, a bed of shifting harmonies. The distant percussive pop of a champagne cork, a sudden sforzando. It was a constant secret performance for an audience of one, a way to keep the most vital part of herself alive in this gilded cage. Tonight the house pianist was butchering a classic. He sat at a magnificent Fazioli grand piano near the sweeping bay windows, his fingers moving across the ivory with a mechanical precision that was an insult to the instrument. He was playing a well-known jazz standard, but he played the notes, not the music. Each chord was perfectly voiced, each run technically clean, but the soul was absent. The swing was rigid, the improvisation predictable. It was the sound of a musician who had long ago traded passion for a steady paycheck, and Alara felt a familiar ache of pity and contempt. She could feel the ghost of the melody, the shape it was supposed to take, the breath it was meant to draw. In her mind, her own fingers danced across the keys, correcting his phrasing, adding a touch of bluesy melancholy to a sterile chord, letting a note hang in the air just a moment longer, to allow its full emotional weight to land. Her focus was drawn to Table 7, the prime seat in the house, currently occupied by Julian Croft and 3 of his associates. Croft was a name that echoed through the city's financial districts like a crack of thunder. A tech billionaire who had built an empire on ruthless efficiency and a seemingly psychic ability to predict market trends. He was younger than the legends he was supplanting, with sharp angular features, eyes the color of a winter storm, and an aura of predatory stillness. He wore a custom-tailored suit that fit him like a second skin, but he wore it like armor, not adornment. He was bored. Alara could see it in the way his long fingers tapped a restless, silent rhythm on the stem of his wineglass, in the way his gaze swept across the room, dismissing everything and everyone with a flicker of cold amusement. His companions, older men with the soft, well-fed look of established power, spoke in low, deferential tones, presenting figures and projections like offerings to a demanding god. Croft would listen, his head tilted slightly before dissecting their arguments with a few quiet, incisive words that left them scrambling. The quarterly growth is stable, Julian, but the acquisition of Aerodyne presents a significant risk. One of the men was saying, his voice a nervous hum. Julian Croft took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Stability is stagnation, Robert, and risk is the price of dominance. Your fear is more of a liability to me than Aerodyne's debt. The word fear was delivered so calmly, so surgically, that it left a trail of ice in the air. Robert paled, stammering an apology that Croft ignored completely. His attention had drifted, snagged by the lifeless music emanating from the Fazioli. He listened for a moment, his expression hardening from boredom into active irritation. He gestured vaguely toward the pianist. Who hired him? He asked, the question directed at no one in particular, yet demanding an answer from the universe. He plays with all the passion of a metronome. It's an offense to the instrument. Alara was refilling their water glasses at that precise moment, her movements practiced and silent. The comment, spoken with such casual cruelty, landed so close to her own thoughts that she flinched. It was an infinitesimal reaction, a fractional tightening of her grip on the water pitcher, a barely perceptible pause in her smooth, circular motion. It was a musician's flinch, an involuntary response from someone who understood the depth of the pianist's failure. It was over in a heartbeat, a secret she thought was hers alone. But nothing about Julian Croft was unobservant. His storm-gray eyes, which had been sweeping across the room with disdain, suddenly snapped into focus, zeroing in on her. He had seen it. He had seen that flicker of shared understanding, that spark of kinship in a language of which the rest of the room was ignorant. He saw a server whose mask had slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimpse of the person beneath. And it intrigued him. A slow, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. For the first time all evening, the profound boredom receded from his features, replaced by a calculated predatory curiosity. His business partners, sensing a shift in his mood, fell silent, watching him. Alara felt his gaze like a physical weight. She finished pouring the water, her movements becoming stiff, self-conscious. The invisibility she had so carefully cultivated was gone, stripped away by a single careless reaction. She wanted to retreat, to melt back into the shadows of the dining room, but she was pinned by his stare. "You," Julian Croft said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere with absolute authority. Alara froze her back to him. She prayed he was speaking to someone else, one of his associates, another server. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, on the perfect arrangement of cutlery and crystal. "Waitress," he called again, the word laced with an impatient silken thread. "Turn around." Slowly forcing her muscles to obey, Alara turned. She kept her eyes lowered, her expression carefully. Neutral, the perfect mask of a service professional. "Yes, sir. May I get you something?" "You may," he said, leaning back in his chair, the picture of relaxed power. He gestured again toward the pianist, who was now fumbling through another soulless rendition of a jazz ballad. "You heard my comment about the entertainment. You seem to agree with my assessment." It was not a question. It was a statement, an accusation. He was playing with her. Ilara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm. This was the nightmare of every person in her position, to be singled out, to be made part of the scenery, to become a diversion for the wealthy and the bored. "I apologize if my reaction was unprofessional, sir." She said, her voice a low, steady murmur she had practiced for just such an occasion. "The music is a matter of personal taste, of course." "Ah, but it isn't, is it?" Croft countered, his smile widening. He was enjoying this. He was a shark that had scented a drop of blood in an ocean of bland water. Taste is for wine and art. Music, real music, is a matter of truth. And the truth is that man is an imposter. He's a technician, not an artist. You know that, don't you? He was pushing, deliberately cornering her. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to peel back the layers of her professional facade and see what lay beneath. His associates watched the exchange with a mixture of apprehension and sycophantic amusement. This was Julian Croft in his element, not just in the boardroom, but here asserting his dominance in the smallest of social interactions. Alara knew the correct answer was to demur, to offer a vague, pleasing platitude and escape. It was the safe play, the one that would allow her to keep her job and pay her rent. But his words, "a technician, not an artist," were a perfect echo of the critique that had been running through her own mind. He understood. On some level, this cold, ruthless man understood the language that was her native tongue, and that more than his cruelty was unsettling. She took a small breath. "He plays all the right notes, sir." It was a careful, diplomatic answer, but the implication was clear to anyone who understood. Julian Croft's eyes lit up. He had found it. The confirmation he was looking for. "Precisely," he whispered, as if she had just shared a profound secret. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fixing her with an intense stare that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. All the right notes in precisely the wrong order. A perfect description. He turned to his companions, his voice now projecting, drawing the attention of the nearby tables. "Gentlemen, it seems we have a hidden connoisseur in our midst. Our waitress, it appears, has an opinion." The word opinion was loaded with sarcasm designed to belittle and dismiss her. Alara felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She could feel the eyes of other patrons turning toward them, their quiet conversations faltering as they sensed the unfolding drama. This was it. The point of no return. She could see the idea forming in Julian Croft's mind, the cruel spark of inspiration. He was bored with his business, bored with his wine, bored with the world he so effortlessly controlled, and he had just found a new toy. He was going to make her his entertainment for the evening. The name on her polished brass tag was Alara. It was a name chosen for its quiet elegance, for the way it flowed off the tongue without leaving a lasting impression. It was a name for a ghost. But as she stood pinned by Julian Croft's merciless gaze, the air in the Ethelgard growing thin and cold, another name echoed in the deepest chambers of her memory. Eli, a name that tasted of chicory coffee and sweet bourbon, a name that belonged to the humid jasmine-scented nights of a city that was a world away. Her mind plunged backward away from the sterile chill of the dining room and into the thick, soulful heat of New Orleans. The memory was so vivid it was a physical sensation. The oppressive summer air, heavy with the promise of rain, clung to her skin. The cacophony of the French Quarter wasn't noise, it was life itself. The mournful wail of a lone saxophone from a second-story balcony, the joyous explosion of a brass band parading down the street, the low rumbling laughter from a crowded bar, it was all part of a grand chaotic symphony. In that world, she was not invisible. She was Eli, a girl with fire in her fingers and the bayou in her blood. Her stage was not a silent, carpeted dining room, but the cramped, sticky corners of legendary jazz clubs, places where the ghosts of giants like Louis Armstrong and Professor Longhair still lingered in the smoky air. Her audience was not comprised of indifferent billionaires, but of tourists and locals, musicians and dreamers, people who came to be moved to feel something real. Her sanctuary was a small, cluttered apartment above a voodoo shop on Dumaine Street. It belonged to Silas, the man who had taught her how to speak the language of jazz. Silas was a living legend, a pianist whose hands, gnarled and twisted with arthritis, had forgotten more about music than most people would ever learn. His face was a roadmap of a life lived hard and true, every wrinkle, a story, every scar, a song. He had played with the greats, his name whispered with reverence by those who knew. She remembered sitting on a worn piano bench beside him, the wood of his ancient, out-of-tune plail upright, warm beneath her hands. The room smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and whiskey. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the grimy window, illuminating the yellowed keys. "Music ain't in the notes, Eli," he'd tell her, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones in a riverbed. "Anybody can learn the notes. It's in the space between 'em. That's where the soul lives. You gotta learn to bend a note till it cries. You gotta learn to play the silence. That's the ghost note, the one you feel more than you hear." He had discovered her when she was 16, playing a battered keyboard for tourists in Jackson Square, her hat filling with loose change. He hadn't heard a child prodigy playing for tips. He had heard a voice. He had taken her under his wing, not as a student, but as an heir to a sacred tradition. He never taught her scales or exercises. He taught her stories. He would play a phrase, a dark, complex chord progression, and say, "That's the sound of a man watching the woman he loves walk away for the last time." Then he would look at her and say, "Now you tell me your story." And she would. Under his guidance, her talent, which had always been a bright, wild thing, was forged into something profound. She learned to pour her life into the music, her joy, her anger, her secret longings. When she played, she was no longer a shy, observant girl. She was a force of nature. The piano was not an instrument. It was an extension of her own heart, a conduit for every emotion she couldn't express in words. She became a local phenomenon, Silas's girl, the prodigy who could make an old upright sing the blues with an authority that belied her years. A scholarship to a prestigious conservatory in the North had followed a golden ticket out of the beautiful, chaotic swamp she called home. Her parents, who had worked their fingers to the bone to pay for her first lessons, had wept with pride. Silas had simply nodded, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "Don't let 'em teach the soul out of you," Eli, was all he said. The first year had been a revelation. She drank in the theory, the history, the discipline. She sharpened her technique until it was a razor's edge, but she never lost the heart Silas had nurtured. She was the star of her class, the jazz prodigy who played with an emotional depth that baffled her classically trained peers. Her future seemed to blaze before her, a path paved with concert halls and recording contracts. And then the phone call came. The world tilted on its axis. It was her father, his voice strained and broken in a way she had never heard. Her mother, who had been the vibrant, unshakable center of their family, had collapsed. Aneurysm. The word was cold, clinical. A sterile blade that sliced through the warm fabric of her life. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospitals, hushed conversations with doctors, and the relentless, terrifying mathematics of medical bills. The conservatory scholarship covered her tuition, not the crushing weight of intensive care, experimental surgeries, and long-term rehabilitation. Insurance was a cruel joke, a net with holes so large a family could fall right through. Eli flew home, trading the pristine practice rooms of the conservatory for the antiseptic corridors of the hospital. She saw her mother, a woman who had once danced in the kitchen to Fats Domino, lying still and small in a hospital bed, a tangle of tubes and wires, her only connection to the world. She saw the lines of exhaustion and fear etched into her father's face. And she saw the bills, piles of them arriving daily, each one an impassive white rectangle that represented a number more terrifying than she could comprehend. Her dream, once so bright and tangible, now seemed like a frivolous, childish fantasy. What was a perfect solo in the face of a mountain of debt? What was a standing ovation compared to the cost of a single day in the ICU? She played the piano in the hospital lobby one afternoon, a desperate prayer sent out into the sterile air. She poured all her fear, all her grief, all her love for her mother into the keys. People stopped to listen, doctors and nurses and worried families, their faces softening as the music washed over them. For a few minutes, the relentless beeping of the machines faded into the background, and there was only the sound of a daughter's breaking heart. But when she finished, the silence that followed was broken by the ringing of a cash register at the gift shop. The bills were still there. The mountain was still growing. The decision was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow, grinding erosion of hope. It was the quiet conversation with her father at the kitchen table, the two of them staring at a spreadsheet of debt that looked like a life sentence. It was the shame of applying for high-interest loans. It was the dawning, soul-crushing realization that her gift, the very thing that made her who she was commercially worthless in the face of a real-world crisis. So she made a choice. Or rather, life made it for her. She dropped out of the conservatory, forfeiting the scholarship. She sold her professional-grade keyboard, the one Silas had helped her buy for a fraction of its worth. She packed a single bag, took a bus to New York City, a place where she could be anonymous, a place where no one knew Eli the prodigy, and started looking for work. She needed a job, any job that offered the best pay and the highest tips, a job where she could become a machine for earning money. She found it at Ethelgard. She learned to walk and talk differently. She adopted the quiet, elegant name Elara. She buried Eli so deep inside her that some days she could almost forget she ever existed. She sent every spare dollar home, watching the mountain of debt slowly, painstakingly shrink. She never told Silas she had quit. Their phone calls were brief and evasive. She couldn't bear to tell him she had silenced the music. It would have felt like a betrayal too great to confess. The only time she allowed herself to touch a piano was in the dead of night in a 24-hour practice studio in a dingy basement in the village. She would pay for an hour with the cash from her tips, her hands trembling as they rediscovered the familiar weight of the keys. But she couldn't play her own music. The stories were too painful to tell. So she would play scales arpeggios, technical exercises, a frantic, joyless penance to keep her fingers from forgetting. She was a technician, not an artist. Just like the man at the Fazioli. Just like the man Julian Croft so rightly despised. A sudden clatter of silverware on a plate jolted her back to the present. She was still standing at table 7, the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. Julian Croft was watching her, his expression a mask of predatory patience. He was waiting for her to break. And in that moment, Elara felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not shame, but a cold, defiant anger. He thought he knew her. He had looked at her uniform, at her polite, empty smile, and had seen a failed dreamer, a nobody. He had no idea of the city of ghosts and music that lived inside her. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea he was talking to Eli. To Julian Croft, the world was a chessboard, and most people were pawns. He had spent the last decade mastering the game, learning to think 10 moves ahead, sacrificing pieces without sentiment to protect his king. His king, of course, was his empire. Tonight's dinner at Ethelgard was merely a late-game maneuver, the slow, inevitable checkmate of a competitor. Robert Francis and Michael, the men seated with him, were not his friends. They were his bishops and rooks, powerful pieces in their own right, but ultimately instruments of his will. He listened to their talk of acquisitions, market shares, and leveraging assets with a detached clinical interest. It was the language he was fluent in, the cold arithmetic of power. He had built a fortress of wealth and influence so high that no one could touch him. From his vantage point, he could see the entire board, the intricate patterns of greed and fear that motivated everyone. And it bored him to the point of a physical ache. The thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by the tedious inevitability of the kill. He already knew he would win. He always did. The emptiness was a familiar companion, a hollow space in his chest that no amount of money or success could fill. He filled his life with beautiful things, art. He didn't feel cars. He didn't have time to drive women who admired his portfolio more than his person, all in a futile attempt to quiet the gnawing silence within. But the silence remained a constant low hum beneath the noise of his achievements. It was the music that brought the hum to the surface tonight, turning it into an irritating buzz. The pianist at the Fazioli was a perfect metaphor for his own life, technically flawless, aesthetically pleasing, and utterly devoid of a soul. Each predictable chord progression, each sterile, uninspired run, was a personal affront. It was a cheap imitation of a language he had once spoken with fierce, desperate passion. Without volition, his mind flashed back a brief, violent tear in the fabric of the present. He wasn't in a multi-million-dollar restaurant. He was 21, in a cramped, smoky club in Greenwich Village, the kind of place that smelled of stale beer and raw possibility. His hands weren't resting on fine Italian linen. They were on the keys of a scarred, cigarette-burned piano. The music wasn't background noise. It was a living, breathing entity pouring out of him a torrent of chaotic, joyful, and painful sound. He remembered the feeling, not thinking about the notes, but feeling them, his entire being dissolved into the logic and emotion of the music. It was the only time he had ever felt truly free, truly himself. And he remembered the betrayal. It wasn't one single event, but a slow, corrosive disillusionment. It was the partner who stole his compositions and sold them for a commercial jingle. It was the woman he loved, telling him his dream was charming, but unsustainable, leaving him for a man with a stable career in finance. It was the 100 small compromises and heartbreaks that taught him a brutal lesson. Passion was a vulnerability, and art was a currency for fools. So he had made a choice. He had taken his brilliant analytical mind, the part of him that could see the intricate structure in a complex jazz symphony, and applied it to the market. He had systematically amputated the artist within, cauterizing the wound with ambition. He had traded the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of music for the cold, predictable certainty of money. He had built his fortress and locked himself inside, believing it was the only way to be safe. He had won the game, but in doing so, he had forfeited his own soul. The pianist's insipid playing was a reminder of that forfeiture. It was the sound of the ghost he had tried so hard to bury. And then he saw her, the waitress. When he'd made the caustic remark about the pianist, it had been a casual act of cruelty, a verbal jab to alleviate his own irritation. He had expected nothing. But he had seen her flinch. It wasn't the reaction of a servant startled by a guest's sharp tone. It was the minute, involuntary wince of an expert hearing a discordant note of a true believer witnessing sacrilege. In that fractional moment, her professional mask had slipped, and he had seen a flicker of something real, something authentic. He saw the ghost. The sight of it in her, a complete stranger, a pawn in the background of his life, was infuriating. It was a judgment. Her silent, expert condemnation of the music was an unconscious condemnation of him, of the choice he had made. She who poured water and cleared plates still possessed the one thing he had meticulously destroyed in himself, a genuine connection to the truth of music. His decision to corner her was an instinct, a predator's impulse to neutralize a threat. It had nothing to do with her and everything to do with him. He needed to prove that her world, the world of feeling and art he had abandoned, was insignificant. He needed to demonstrate its fragility in the face of his power. By humiliating her, by forcing her to confront the futility of her own presumed passion, he was validating the choice he had made all those years ago. He was proving to himself that the fortress was the only place to be, and that anyone left outside in the cold world of feeling was a fool deserving of their fate. You know that, don't you? He pressed, watching the conflict play out in the subtle tightening of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand. He could see her calculating the risks, weighing her dignity against her livelihood. He was enjoying the process, the slow, methodical dissection of another human being. It was the same cold thrill he felt when orchestrating a corporate takeover, when she gave her careful diplomatic answer. "He plays all the right notes, sir." It was like a beautifully executed parry in a fencing match. She hadn't surrendered, but she hadn't attacked either. She had acknowledged his point with a technicality a musician's coded language. It was a move of intelligence and control, and it only deepened his fascination. This was more interesting than Robert's tedious talk of quarterly growth. He decided to escalate to force her out from behind her defenses. He broadcast her descent to his table, to the room, turning his private interrogation into a public spectacle. He used sarcasm as his weapon, framing her opinion as an amusing presumption, the quaint notion of a pawn thinking it had a strategy. He watched her waiting. He expected her to crumble, to offer a flustered apology and retreat. That was what pawns did when confronted by a king. They were by definition expendable, their only purpose to be sacrificed for a larger goal. His goal in this moment was the utter annihilation of the ghost. She had so carelessly revealed the ghost that was in truth his own. He needed to see her fail, to prove that her artistic truth was no match for his material reality. But as he looked at her, at the quiet defiance hardening in her eyes, he felt a flicker of something else, something unwelcome and unfamiliar. It was a sliver of doubt. For the first time in a very long time, Julian Croft had the unsettling feeling that he had miscalculated his opponent. He was playing a game whose rules he had long since forgotten against a piece he couldn't identify, and for a man who was never surprised, it was the most dangerous feeling in the world. The word opinion hung in the air, glittering with malice. Julian Croft had aimed it with the precision of a marksman, and it found its target. In a place like Ethelgard, an opinion from a waitress was a transgression, a tear in the seamless fabric of the social order. It was an amusing novelty, like a dog walking on its hind legs, and the audience was beginning to take notice. Conversations at the adjacent tables, which had been a low, discreet murmur, began to falter. A man discussing art auctions paused mid-sentence, his head turning. A woman adorned in emeralds lowered her champagne flute, her perfectly arched eyebrows rising in curiosity. The silence, once a symbol of refined luxury, was transforming. It was becoming heavy, expectant, the charged stillness before a lightning strike. Alara felt the shift in the room's atmosphere as a change in pressure. The air grew thick, making it difficult to breathe. Each beat of her heart was a loud, clumsy drum against the sophisticated quiet. She felt naked, exposed, the carefully constructed shell of her invisibility shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was no longer a server. She was the spectacle. Now, Robert," Julian said, turning to the man who had dared to mention the word fear earlier. Julian's voice was smooth as silk, but it was the silk of a spider's web. "You were concerned about risk. Let's engage in a small one right here. A bit of sport to liven up this dreary evening." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Julian, I'm not sure this is appropriate." "Nonsense," Croft cut him off, his eyes sparkling with a cruel light. He looked back at Alara, his gaze traveling from her sensible black shoes up to her face, which she was struggling to keep impassive. "Our waitress here, our hidden critic, has made a bold claim. She implies that our paid professional is inadequate. That's a serious accusation in the world of art, is it not? It suggests she knows better." He let the implication hang in the air, a public indictment. Ilara's mind raced, searching for an escape route, a polite phrase that would diffuse the situation. "Sir, I assure you that was not my intention," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Yet every syllable was a monumental effort of control. "You were merely being honest," Julian finished for her, his smile widening. It was a predatory expression, all teeth and no warmth. A rare and admirable quality. So rare, in fact, that I'm willing to wager on it. He turned back to his associates, his voice rising, performing now for the entire room. "I will bet you, Robert, say $10,000 that this woman cannot play a single coherent piece of music on that piano. Not a nursery rhyme, not a pop song, nothing." A collective soft gasp rippled through the nearby tables. $10,000. He had just placed a monetary value on her humiliation. He had turned her into a commodity, a gamble, a thing to be won or lost. The act was so profoundly demeaning, so casually cruel, that it took Alara's breath away. She was no longer a person. She was a proposition. Robert paled. "Julian, for God's sake, this is absurd. Let the woman do her job." It was a weak protest, the token resistance of a man who knew better than to truly defy his king. I am letting her do her job, Julian retorted smoothly. Her new job is to settle this wager, unless of course she has no talent to back up her very strong opinions, in which case she is a fraud, and I despise fraud. He looked directly at Alara, his eyes cold and hard as diamonds. So which is it? Are you an artist in disguise, or are you just a waitress with an inflated sense of self-worth? The trap was perfect. To refuse was to admit he was right to confirm in front of this entire room of powerful people that she was nothing more than what her uniform suggested. It would be a confession of her own failure. To accept was to step into a gladiatorial arena she had not chosen to perform on command for the amusement of her tormentor. She could feel the weight of every eye in the restaurant. The floor manager, a perpetually flustered man named Sergio, hovered near the service station, his face a mask of horror and indecision. He was frozen, caught between his duty to his staff and his terror of a guest, who could likely buy the entire restaurant group, with the loose change in his pocket. No help would come from him. "Sir, this is a restaurant, not a stage." Alara tried, her voice shaking almost imperceptibly. "My duties do not include—" "Your duties are whatever I say they are until I pay the bill." Julian interrupted, his voice losing its playful edge and taking on a spine of pure steel. The mask of the charming host had slipped, revealing the ruthless tyrant beneath. "I am paying for an experience here. An evening of fine dining and ambiance. The ambiance is currently being ruined by a talentless hack on that piano. You have claimed to possess a superior understanding. I am now offering you the chance to prove it. It's quite simple, really." He stood up. The movement was fluid and commanding, drawing every last ounce of attention in the room. He was a conductor, and this humiliating symphony was his creation. He walked the few steps from his table to where she stood, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold, hard money. "Think of it as a performance review," he murmured, his voice low now for her ears. Only though the threat was no less potent. "You impress me, you settle the bet, and perhaps there's a generous tip in it for you. You refuse, and I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every restaurant of this caliber in this city knows that Ethelgard employs insubordinate staff who insult the clientele. Your choice." The threat was unambiguous. He wasn't just threatening her job here. He was threatening her livelihood, her ability to survive in this city to pay for her mother's care. He was threatening to crush her. The fire of anger that had sparked within her was doused by a wave of cold, pragmatic fear. He could do it. She had no doubt. A man like Julian Croft could ruin a person with a single phone call and idle whim. He held all the power and she held none. He stepped back, his public persona firmly back in place. He gestured with a grand, theatrical sweep of his arm toward the magnificent Fazioli piano, its polished black surface gleaming under the soft lights. It looked less like an instrument and more like an altar for a sacrifice. "The stage is prepared," he announced to the silent watching room. "The audience is waiting. All that is missing is our star." His words, his actions, the unbearable weight of the room's collective gaze, it all converged on her. She was trapped. Every escape route was blocked. She looked from Julian's triumphant smiling face to the nervous, complicit faces of his associates, to the curious, pitiless faces of the other diners. They were all waiting for the show to begin. They were all waiting to see her fall. Her past and present collided in that single agonizing moment. She thought of Eli, the girl who could command a crowded room with nothing but a piano and her own fiery spirit. And she looked at Alara, the ghost who was about to be exorcised in the most public way imaginable. Julian Croft thought he was betting on her ability to play the piano. But he was wrong. He was betting on her fear. He was betting that the waitress had finally and completely consumed the artist. He was betting that she would break. Time seemed to warp and stretch in the suffocating silence. For Ilara, the grand dining room of Ethelgard collapsed into a single, claustrophobic point of pressure. The soft lighting seemed to burn with the intensity of 1,000 interrogators' lamps. The muted clinking of distant silverware sounded like the slow, deliberate cocking of a hammer. Julian Croft's challenge was not a request. It was a sentence, and she was standing on the gallows he had built for her. Her first instinct was a primal, screaming urge for survival. It was the voice of Alara, the pragmatic ghost she had created to navigate this cold new world. "Apologize," the voice hissed in her mind. "Debase yourself. Cry if you have to. Give him the victory he wants. This is not a battle you can win. This is about your mother's medical care. This is about the rent. This is about survival. The voice was logical, sensible. It painted a clear, brutal picture of the consequences of defiance. She saw herself blacklisted, unemployed, the trickle of money she sent home every week drying up completely. She saw her father's face already worn with worry crumbling into despair. She saw the mountain of debt which she had so painstakingly chipped away at rising once more to become an insurmountable peak. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. Dignity did not pay for prescription medication. She opened her mouth, the words of surrender already forming on her tongue. A humble apology. A plea for his understanding. A self-deprecating laugh to signal her acceptance of the joke. She would play his game, be the court jester, and then melt back into the shadows, diminished but employed. It was the smart move. It was the only move. But as the first syllable of her surrender tried to escape, another voice rose from a part of her she had thought long dead. It was a deeper, wilder sound, a ghost note from her own past. It was the voice of Eli. "He thinks you are nothing," it snarled with a fury that startled her. "He has stripped you down in front of these people and called you a fraud. He is standing on the grave of your dream and laughing. And you are going to hand him a shovel." The anger was a shock to her system, a sudden searing heat that burned through the cold fog of her fear. This wasn't just about a job. It was about an execution. Julian Croft was not merely trying to embarrass a waitress. He was trying to extinguish the last flickering ember of the artist she had once been. He was trying to prove that his world of cold, hard cash was the only one that mattered, and that her world of beauty and soul was a pathetic illusion. He was proving it to the room, but more importantly, he was trying to prove it to himself by using her as his evidence. The two voices warred within her, a violent, silent scherzo. Alara the survivor versus Eli the artist. Pragmatism versus passion. The present versus the past. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her apron, clenched into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the choice being to step back into the safety of servitude, or to leap into the terrifying unknown abyss of defiance. And then through the chaotic noise in her head came a third voice. It was a low, gravelly rumble, as warm and familiar as the Louisiana sun. It was the voice of Silas. The memory bloomed sharp and clear, pushing aside the oppressive reality of the Ethelgard. She was 17 again, backstage at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. It was her first time playing a major stage, and she was paralyzed with fear. The anonymous roar of the crowd sounded like a hungry beast. Her hands were slick with sweat, her heart hammering a frantic offbeat rhythm against her ribs. She was convinced she would fail, that she would walk out on that stage and forget how to play, that she would humiliate herself and him. Silas had found her huddled in a dark corner, trying to disappear into herself. He hadn't offered empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He had simply placed his large, gnarled hand on her shoulder, the touch both grounding and gentle. "What are you so scared of, child?" he had asked. Forgetting the notes she had whispered, the fear making her voice thin. "Making a mistake. They're all out there. Listening." Silas had let out a low chuckle. "Good. Let 'em listen. But you ain't up there to play notes. The notes are just the excuse. You're up there to tell the truth. Your truth." He leaned in closer, his eyes cloudy with age but sharp with wisdom, locking onto hers. "Listen to me now, Eli. This is the most important thing I can ever teach you. Music ain't what you do. It ain't a job. It ain't a hobby. Music is not what you play, Eli. It's who you are. And you don't ever let anyone silence who you are. Not a record executive, not a bad review, not a room full of suits, and damn sure not the fear in your own head. Now you go out there and you be who you are. Loud." The memory was so powerful it was like a physical jolt. It's who you are. The chaos in her mind stilled. The warring voices fell silent. A profound, crystalline clarity settled over her. The choice was not about her job. It was not about the money. It was not even about Julian Croft and his cruel, pathetic games. He was irrelevant. This was about her soul. For 2 years, she had allowed her circumstances to silence her. She had let fear and debt and pragmatism mute the most essential part of her being. She had convinced herself it was a necessary sacrifice, a noble act of self-denial for her family. But Silas's voice from the past revealed the lie. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was a slow suicide. And Julian Croft was simply offering to pull the trigger. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw past the expensive suit and the predatory smile. She saw a profoundly empty man, a man so terrified of his own ghost that he had to hunt it down and kill it in others. She saw a man who had silenced himself long ago and couldn't bear to hear an authentic note from anyone else. And in that moment, she did not feel fear or anger. She felt a vast aching pity for him. She would not play for him. She would not play for his bet. She would not play for the silent gawking audience. She would play for Silas. She would play for the 17-year-old girl terrified backstage. She would play for her mother whose strength she had inherited. She would play for Eli. She would be who she was, loud. A subtle transformation took place. The tension in her shoulders eased. The frantic drumming of her heart slowed to a steady, deliberate tempo. The panicked look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, unwavering focus. She took one deep, cleansing breath, and it felt like the first real breath she had taken in 2 years. She gave Julian Croft a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of submission. It was an acknowledgement, a signal that the terms of the engagement had just changed. Then without another word, she turned her back on him. The act was so simple, so quiet, yet it was a revolution. She walked away from the center of the storm he had created, her posture erect, her steps measured and sure. She walked not with the hurried, self-effacing shuffle of a server, but with the deliberate, graceful gait of a performer approaching her stage. Every eye in the room followed her, the silence now thick with confusion and a dawning sense of anticipation. She walked toward the gleaming black fazioli, toward the altar he had chosen for her sacrifice. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was leading a lamb to the slaughter. He had no idea he had just uncaged a lion. The distance from table 7 to the fazioli grand piano was perhaps 50 feet. To Alara, it felt like the longest walk of her life. With every step, she could feel the layers of her carefully constructed disguise falling away. The stiff, self-effacing posture of the waitress straightened into the poised, centered alignment of a concert pianist. The hurried, soundless steps slowed to a deliberate, dignified pace. She was no longer moving to serve. She was moving to command. A wave of whispers followed her, a sibilant tide of speculation. Julian Croft remained standing by his table, a faint, mocking smile still playing on his lips, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. He had expected a walk of shame, a clumsy, reluctant shuffle toward the instrument. He had not expected this procession. This was the walk of someone who knew exactly where she was going, of someone who felt more at home on a stage than on a dining room floor. The hired pianist, who had been lingering awkwardly near the instrument, scurried away as she approached, a look of profound confusion on his face. The piano bench was set too high positioned for his lanky frame. Alara reached it, and without a moment's hesitation placed her hands on the leather seat. She rotated it with a practiced fluid motion, a full turn and a quarter counterclockwise, adjusting it to her precise, memorized height. It was an unconscious, intimate gesture, the act of a craftsman picking up a familiar tool. At his table, Julian's smile faltered. His associate Robert leaned in and whispered, "She seems to know what she's doing." Julian shot him a withering glare that silenced him immediately, but the seed of doubt had been planted. This was not proceeding according to his script. Alara sat her back perfectly straight, her shoulders relaxed. She took a moment to feel the space around her, the weight of the room, the texture of the silence that was now hers to command. She placed her foot on the sustain pedal, testing its resistance, feeling the subtle mechanical response through the sole of her shoe. She let her fingers hover for just a breath over the cool, polished ivory of the keys. In that moment, the Ethelgard and its gilded patrons ceased to exist. There was only her and the 88 keys that comprised the language of her soul. The rage, the fear, the humiliation, it all melted away, replaced by the profound, centering calm that only music could bring. She was home. Then she began to play. The first sound that emerged from the $70,000 piano was not the clumsy fumbling Julian had wagered on. It was not a strident, attention-grabbing chord. It was a single questioning note, a soft, melancholic G minor that fell into the silent room like a raindrop into a still pool. It hung in the air, shimmering with a sorrow so pure and profound that it was almost painful to hear. It was followed by another, then, a cascade of quiet, introspective chords, that seemed to speak of twilight and long shadows. It was not a recognizable tune. It was an invention, a story beginning to unfold. It was the sound of a locked door slowly creaking open. Julian Croft, who had been prepared to laugh, felt the smile freeze on his face. His extensive classical and jazz education, a relic of the life he had abandoned, was a curse in this moment. He could not dismiss this as amateurish. He recognized the sophisticated voicing of the chords, the subtle rhythmic complexity, the sheer unadulterated musicality of her touch. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was not listening to a waitress. The music began to build. The quiet, questioning theme blossomed into a haunting melody that coiled through the restaurant like a wisp of smoke. It was a melody of loss of a dream packed away in a dusty attic. It spoke of humid Louisiana nights and the taste of goodbye. Alara's eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm she was creating. She was no longer in New York. She was channeling the ghost of Eli, telling the story of her exile. Her left hand wove a complex rolling arpeggio in the bass register, a river of sound that was both the foundation and the current, while her right hand sang the lonely, aching melody. The technique was staggering, the dexterity, the independence of her hands, the dynamic control that allowed her to shift from a whisper to a cry, in the space of a single measure. This was not the product of a few community college lessons. This was the product of a life dedicated to the instrument. Around the room, the spell was taking hold. Forks halfway to mouths were lowered back to plates. Wine glasses were held forgotten in midair. All conversation ceased not out of polite deference, but out of genuine stunned captivation. The patrons of Ethelgard were a notoriously difficult audience, jaded by their access to the best of everything. They had seen and heard it all, but they had never heard anything like this. Not here, not from someone who had just served them their entrees. The story and the music shifted. The melancholy deepened, then gave way to a section of frantic, dissonant energy. The chords became denser, the rhythm more agitated. It was the sound of crisis of a world thrown into chaos. It was the sterile panic of a hospital corridor, the relentless ticking of a clock, the terror of a life hanging in the balance. Ilara's fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of controlled fury. The music was no longer just sad. It was raw, desperate, and fiercely intelligent. Julian felt a strange, unwelcome tightening in his chest. The music was getting under his skin, bypassing the cynical armor he had spent years perfecting. It was speaking a language his soul remembered, even if his mind refused to listen. He felt an echo of his own past in her, playing the rage. The feeling of a world betrayed the burning passion he had thought he had successfully extinguished. He looked at her truly, seeing her for the first time, and he did not see a waitress. He saw an artist stripped bare and burning with a fire he had long since allowed to die in himself. And the sight of it was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The $10,000 bet was a distant, ludicrous memory. His associates were staring at Ilara, their mouths slightly agape. The power dynamics of the table of the entire room had been completely rewritten. He, Julian Croft, the master of the universe, had become a mere spectator. He had set the stage for a public humiliation, and instead he was witnessing a private transfiguration. The frantic, chaotic section of the piece resolved, suddenly collapsing into a quiet, breathtakingly beautiful passage. It was the sound of resignation of a painful choice being made. The melody returned, but it was different now, transformed by the struggle that had preceded it. It was tinged with a weary resilience, the quiet strength of a survivor. It was the sound of a dream being laid to rest, a requiem for a life left behind. Ilara played with a maturity and emotional depth that was devastating. Every note was infused with meaning. Every phrase was perfectly shaped. She was not merely playing the piano. She was making it confess. The magnificent Fazioli, which had sounded so sterile and empty in the hands of the house pianist, was now weeping, raging, and singing under her touch. She reached the climax of her improvisation. She built the tension with a series of rising, powerful chords, each one more emotionally charged than the last. The sound filled the restaurant, swelling to a volume that seemed impossible from a single instrument. It was a sound of defiance, of grief, of love, of every unspoken truth she had carried inside her for 2 long, silent years. It was the voice of Eli, finally, undeniably refusing to be silenced any longer. The final chord was a massive, resonant declaration. It was both a cry of anguish and a statement of unbreakable strength. It rang out through the Ethelgard, a sound of such shocking, beautiful, and honest power that it seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. Then, as the last vibrations of the chord began to fade, she let the music dissolve into a final, lingering whisper, a single soft note that hung in the absolute ringing silence of the room like a solitary star in a dark sky. The final lingering note of Alara's improvisation faded, leaving a silence in its wake that was more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum, a space hollowed out by the sheer emotional force of what had just transpired. The entire dining room of Ethelgard seemed to be holding a collective breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The spell was absolute. For a single suspended moment, the waitress and the billionaire, the waiters and the patrons were all united in a state of stunned reverence. Julian Croft sat motionless, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. The part of him that was the ruthless CEO was already calculating the damage, assessing the catastrophic miscalculation he had made. He had intended to humiliate a subordinate, and had instead been present for the birth of a star, casting himself as the villain in a story that would be whispered at dinner parties for the next decade. The professional humiliation was immense. But the other part of him, the ghost of the artist he had tried to murder 20 years ago, was reeling from a different kind of shock. He was not merely impressed. He was shaken. He had not just heard a masterful performance. He had witnessed a confession. The music she had played was not a sterile display of technique. It was a story, and it was a story he understood on a cellular level. The loss, the rage, the weary resilience, it was a language his own soul remembered. The applause should have started then. A polite cough should have broken the tension. But Alara's hands did not leave the keys. She remained at the piano, her eyes still closed, as if listening to a song only she could hear. The audience waited confused. Julian watched, a strange sense of dread coiling in his stomach. Then her fingers began to move again. This was different. The grand emotional storm of her improvisation subsided, giving way to something quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more disturbing. A new melody emerged from the silence, a fragile, searching phrase. It was a sequence of notes that seemed to defy conventional harmony, a progression of chords that was at once dissonant and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was a question being asked in a language that had been forgotten. To most people in the room, it was simply a strange, quiet coda to the magnificent performance. To Julian, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 2 decades. He froze. The wineglass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. The blood in his veins seemed to turn to ice. His breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. It was a coincidence, a trick of the ear. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. He must have heard a similar phrasing in a different piece. It was a common jazz motif he was misremembering. But she played it again. This time she harmonized it with a series of dark, brooding chords in the bass chords that gave the strange melody a feeling of profound, inescapable fate. There was no mistake. There was no coincidence. He knew that melody. He knew it better than he knew his own heartbeat. It was his. The Ethelgard dissolved. The faces of his associates, the crystal chandeliers, the entire gilded cage of his life evaporated. He was 21 again, and the air was not filled with the scent of truffle oil, but with the smell of cheap coffee and dust in his mentor's cramped Greenwich Village apartment. The memory was so violent, so complete, that he felt a physical jolt. He was standing over Silas's shoulder, the old man seated at his scarred upright piano. Julian, young and arrogant and burning with a talent that felt like a fever, was trying to explain the revolutionary new sound he had discovered. "You see, Silas," he had said, his voice brimming with the impatient energy of youth. He'd pushed the old man's hands gently off the keys and played the phrase himself. The exact same phrase. The strange questioning melody. The ghost note. The harmony is built on a descending tritone substitution, but it resolves upwards to the minor fourth. It shouldn't work theoretically. It breaks the rules. But it feels right. It's the sound of wanting something you know will destroy you. Silas had listened, his head tilted, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. He'd taken a long drag from his unfiltered cigarette and blown a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "It's a dangerous sound, kid," he had rumbled, full of heartache. "Where you gonna go with it?" "It's the centerpiece," Julian had explained, his fingers flying across the keys, sketching out the grand architecture of his vision. "For the symphony. My jazz symphony. It will be the recurring theme, the ghost that haunts the entire piece. He had never written that symphony. He had never shown that musical phrase to another living soul. It was a secret between him, Silas, and God. It was the most original, the most authentic, the most him piece of music he had ever composed before he had traded his piano for a stock ticker and his soul for a corner office. Back in the Ethelgard, the sound of that secret was filling the silent room, emanating from the fingers of a woman he had tried to destroy. Julian's mind fractured. The fortress he had built around himself, the walls of logic and cynicism and power, crumbled to dust. This was not possible. How could she know? How could this waitress be playing the most intimate, secret melody of his long-buried past had Silas betrayed him? Was this some elaborate, cruel joke orchestrated by his old mentor? But Silas had to be nearly 90 if he was even still alive. The idea was insane. She was developing the theme now, improvising on it with an understanding that was both terrifying and profound. She was exploring its harmonic possibilities, finding nuances and emotional depths in it that he himself had only ever hinted at. It was as if she had not just heard the melody, but had somehow absorbed its very essence, its meaning. The story of wanting something you know will destroy you. She was finishing the thought he had started and abandoned 20 years ago. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow. He dropped his wine glass. It didn't shatter. It landed on the thick plush carpet with a soft, dull thud that was audible in the absolute silence. No one noticed. Every eye was on the woman at the piano. But Julian was no longer seeing her. He was seeing a ghost of his youth, of his talent, of the man he was supposed to be. And it was sitting at a Fazioli 50 feet away, playing the soundtrack to his own damnation. Then the final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place. The realization was not a thought, but a flash of cold white light in the center of his brain. Silas. It had to be Silas. There was no other explanation in the universe. This woman, this waitress with the fire in her fingers and the sorrow in her music, had to know his old mentor. The old man must have played it for her, told her the story of his most promising, most disappointing student. The knowledge did not bring clarity. It brought a deeper, more vertiginous sense of dread. His past was not dead. He had not successfully buried it. He had only abandoned it. And now it had come back to find him wearing the uniform of a waitress and playing a melody that nobody else was supposed to know. The game he had started, the cruel sport of humiliating a servant, was over. A new, far more dangerous game had just begun, and he had the terrifying suspicion that he was no longer a player. He was the board itself. Ilara's fingers lifted from the keys. The final ethereal note of Julian Croft's ghost melody hung in the air, a shimmering thread of sound before dissolving into a silence that was absolute and profound. For a long suspended moment, the Ethelgard was a portrait of suspended animation. Diners sat like statues, their faces etched with a shared collective awe. Julian remained a stone figure at his table, his fallen wineglass forgotten at his feet. The world had stopped turning. The silence was broken by a single startling sound. From the corner of the room where he had been standing against the wall, like a man in a trance, the hired pianist began to clap. It was not the polite, rhythmic applause of a respectful audience. It was a slow, deliberate, powerful clap. The sound of a professional acknowledging a master. The sound of a man who understood better than anyone the miracle he had just witnessed. That single sound was the signal. It was the crack in the dam. A woman in emeralds at a nearby table, tears streaming silently down her face, shot to her feet and joined the applause. Then another table and another. Within seconds, the curated quiet of the Ethelgard was shattered by a thunderous, roaring wave of ovation. It was a sound the restaurant had never heard before, not for a celebrity sighting, not for a perfectly executed dish, but for a moment of raw, undeniable, transcendent art. One by one, the patrons rose to their feet, their applause growing in intensity. They were no longer patrons, and she was no longer a waitress. They were an audience, and she was the artist who had just seized them by the soul and refused to let go. Ilara slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the soft lights, as if waking from a deep, intense dream. The sound of the applause rushed in, disorienting her. She looked down at her own hands resting on the ivory keys, a faint tremor running through them from the sheer exertion. They felt like strangers to her, like conduits for a power that had flowed through her but did not entirely belong to her. She had forgotten where she was. In the trance of the music, she had been back in New Orleans with Silas. She had been in the sterile quiet of the hospital. She had been everywhere but here. Now the reality of her surroundings came crashing back. The sea of anonymous wealthy faces, all standing, all looking at her. The half-eaten plates of expensive food. The uniform she was wearing, which now felt like a costume from a play that had just ended. With a grace born of years of recitals, she stood. She gave a small, dignified nod, a gesture of acknowledgement to the roaring room. There was no triumph in her expression, no vindictive pleasure. There was only the quiet, weary calm of a messenger who has finally delivered a difficult, vital message. But across the room, Julian Croft did not stand. He did not clap. He was an island of deathly stillness in a sea of motion. The thunderous applause was a distant, irrelevant noise like the sound of a storm miles away. The only sound in his universe was the ghost note still echoing in the chambers of his memory. His face was a bloodless mask. The carefully constructed facade of the ruthless billionaire, the master of the game, had not just been cracked. It had been pulverized, leaving the raw, terrified face of the 21-year-old artist he thought he had successfully murdered. His mind was a feedback loop of impossibility, replaying the moment she had played his secret, the moment his past had reached out and reclaimed him. Julian, Robert said, his voice tentative. He reached out to touch his arm. "Julian, are you all right?" Julian flinched at the touch as if it were a brand. He didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge him. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on Alara, and on Alara alone. His entire world, his vast empire, his carefully ordered life had contracted to the 50-foot space between his chair and that piano. He saw it all in her. He saw Silas's wisdom. He saw the village clubs. He saw the burning passion he had traded for profit margins and market share. He saw the life he could have had, the man he could have been. And the sight of it was an agony more profound than any financial loss he could ever imagine. The $10,000 bet, his cruel words, his theatrical display of power, it all seemed like the pathetic posturing of a child in the face of this terrible, beautiful truth. As the applause began to subside, replaced by a buzzing electric murmur of excited conversation, Julian finally moved. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff, disjointed like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. He ignored the questioning looks from his associates, ignored the curious stares of the other diners. The room fell silent once more as he began to walk. He did not stride with his usual predatory confidence. He moved as if wading through deep water, every step an effort. He navigated the narrow spaces between the tables, his eyes never leaving her, a man walking toward his own ghost. The patrons parted for him, sensing that the evening's true drama was only just reaching its climax. Alara watched him approach, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. The calm she had felt at the piano was beginning to recede, replaced by a wary, uncertain tension. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely, so violently, that the air between them crackled. He was no longer the king, and she was no longer the pawn. They were two survivors of an explosion standing in the wreckage, and she had no idea what he would do next. He stopped directly in front of her, mere feet from the piano that had served as both her weapon and her shield. He looked smaller than he had at his table, stripped of his armor of arrogance. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a raw, unmasked vulnerability that was more shocking than any display of anger would have been. He looked lost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first. He swallowed a visible effort. The silence stretched thick and unbearable. Finally, he found his voice. It was not the commanding baritone that had silenced boardrooms and terrified competitors. It was a hoarse, broken whisper, stripped of all its power, all its artifice. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something impossible and was begging for an explanation that could put his world back together. Where he began, his voice cracking on the single word. He took a shallow breath and tried again, the question tearing its way out of him. "Where did you hear that melody?" Julian Croft's question, a ragged whisper torn from the depths of his being, hung in the charged silence between them. "Where did you hear that melody?" It was the desperate plea of a man seeing his own ghost, begging it to explain itself. The entire restaurant, from the patrons in their designer clothes to the busboys hovering by the service doors, seemed to lean in, straining to hear the answer to a question they didn't understand, but recognized as fundamentally important. Alara looked at the man before her, a titan of industry brought to his knees by a handful of notes. The fear she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a profound and weary clarity. She held the key to his past, a story entrusted to her by an old man in a dusty New Orleans apartment, and she now had to decide whether to use it to unlock his prison or seal his tomb. She could have been cruel. She could have leveraged this moment for everything it was worth, named a price for her silence, and walked away with a fortune large enough to solve all her worldly problems. It was the move Julian himself would have made. It was the logic of the world he inhabited. But she was not a creature of his world. She was a disciple of Silas, and Silas had taught her that music was about truth. His name was Silas, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying with perfect clarity in the hushed room. He lived in an apartment on Dumaine Street. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old secrets. The name landed like a physical blow. Julian staggered back a half step, his hand rising instinctively to his chest as if to protect his heart. A low, wounded sound escaped his lips. The last of his defenses, the last vestiges of the powerful CEO, crumbled into dust. He was just a man exposed and bleeding in the center of a five-star restaurant. He was my mentor. Alara continued, her voice gentle, not with pity, but with the simple gravity of a historian recounting a known fact. He taught me everything I know about the soul of a piano. And sometimes when I was struggling, when I was thinking about giving up, he would tell me stories. She held his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. He told me a story about his most brilliant student, a boy from New York, a young composer who could hear the future of music, a boy who wrote a melody so beautiful and so dangerous that it haunted him, a boy who Silas said got scared and traded his soul for a kingdom. Every word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Julian's denial. He could see it in her eyes, she knew. She knew his story. She knew his shame. He never told me your name, Alara said. He just called you his ghost note, the music that was never finished. She paused, letting the weight of the name settle. He would play that melody for me. Your melody. He said it was the purest piece of musical truth he had ever heard. And he used it as a cautionary tale, a lesson on what happens when an artist betrays his own gift. The story laid bare was more devastating than any accusation. It wasn't a condemnation from her. It was a final message from his past delivered by the most unlikely of messengers. The kingdom he had built was nothing more than a monument to the artist he had abandoned. Julian's mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was failing him. It scrambled for a response, a strategy, a way to regain control. And in his desperation, he reverted to the only tool he had left, the only language he was still fluent in: money. "I'll pay you," he said, the words rushing out clumsy and frantic. "Anything. That bet. The 10,000 is yours. 100,000. 1,000,000. Name a price for what I did to you tonight. I'll give you a record deal. I have a contact at Sony Classical. We can be in a studio next week. I'll fund your entire career. You'll never have to serve another table for the rest of your life." It was a desperate, panicked barrage of solutions, an attempt to turn this messy, emotional cataclysm back into a transaction. He was trying to buy his way out of his own haunting, to pay the ghost to go away. He was offering her a golden cage, trying to make her a part of his world of purchased things, because it was the only way he knew how to interact with anything of value. His associates at the table looked on, stunned into silence by the raw, naked desperation of their leader. The patrons watched, mesmerized by this bizarre and intimate negotiation. Ilara listened to his frantic offers, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than calm resolve entered her eyes. It was disappointment. He still didn't understand. She took a slow breath and shook her head. No. The single word was quiet, but it had the force of a thunderclap. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. Of all the possible outcomes he might have calculated, this was not one of them. He had offered her the world, and she had refused. What he stammered. "What do you mean, no? Everyone has a price." It was the central creed of his life, the unwavering principle upon which he had built his empire. "You're wrong," she said softly. "Some things can't be bought. And some things, once they're sold, can never be bought back." She looked from his pale, shocked face to the magnificent piano beside her. "You think this was about money? About a career? This was never about that. You challenged me to prove I was an artist. But the real challenge was never for me. It was for you." She took a step closer to him, closing the distance, her voice dropping to an intense, confidential pitch. The entire restaurant seemed to lean forward with her. "I don't want your money, Mr. Croft. It's the most boring thing about you." The line was delivered without malice, but it was a more profound insult than any curse she could have leveled. "I don't want your record deal. And I don't want your charity." He stared at her, utterly lost, his face a mask of incomprehension. He had offered her everything he was, and she had just told him it was worthless. "So what do you want?" He whispered the question raw with a vulnerability he hadn't shown to another human being in 20 years. Alara looked deep into his eyes, and for the first time she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the sad, wise smile of an old soul. "I want the composer," she said. Silas believed that melody was a masterpiece. He was right, but it's wounded. It's a fragment. It's an unfinished symphony. She held his gaze, her own unwavering, and delivered the final impossible challenge. "I don't want you to pay me. I want you to play with me. Help me finish it. Let's finish the story. Together." The offer hung in the air between them, audacious and terrifying. She was not asking for his wealth. She was demanding his ghost. She was not asking to be saved from her life. She was offering to save him from his. She was challenging him to do the one thing he had spent 2 decades proving he could not do: face the music. Alara's challenge, a quiet declaration of war against his entire way of life, filled the space between them. "Help me finish it. Together." It was an impossible offer, an invitation to a past he had bricked up and buried. The Julian Croft he had meticulously constructed over 20 years, the predator, the king, the architect of a vast and sterile empire, had no answer for it. That man knew only how to acquire, conquer, and discard. He did not know how to create. He did not know how to heal. He stared at her, and in the depths of her calm, steady gaze, he saw the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a different path. He saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who believed in the dangerous, beautiful truth of music. For 2 decades, he had run from that boy, building walls of money and power to keep his ghost at bay. Now the ghost was standing before him, offering not a haunting, but a handshake. His mind, a machine of ruthless logic, screamed at him to refuse. To laugh in her face, call her bluff, destroy her with the crushing weight of his fortune as he had originally intended. It was the safe move, the one that would return him to the familiar, predictable chessboard of his life. But for the first time, the safety of his fortress felt like a prison. The silence within its walls was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. He looked past her at the room full of people who feared and envied him, but who did not know him. He looked at his associates, men who reflected his own ambition back at him like a distorted mirror. He looked at the trappings of a life that cost a fortune, but was worth nothing. It was a kingdom of ghosts. And then he looked back at her. She was offering him a single authentic note in a life of calculated noise. It was the most terrifying and valuable thing he had ever been offered. He gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture was so small, yet it was an earthquake. It was the capitulation of an empire. The surrender of a king to a principle he had long forgotten. A collective sigh of relief and disbelief seemed to pass through the restaurant. The tension that had held the room in a state of suspended animation finally broke. Ilara's shoulders, which she had held so rigidly, relaxed by a fraction. She had extended her hand into the darkness, and something had taken it. Julian turned, his movement still slow, as if he were learning how to operate his own body again. He walked back to his table. His associates watched him with a mixture of fear and confusion, as if their leader had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. He ignored them. He took his platinum checkbook from the inner pocket of his jacket, opened it on the table, and began to write. Robert leaned in. "Julian, what are you doing? The bet is off. We don't need to. This isn't for the bet." Julian said, his voice quiet but firm, the first hint of his old authority returning, but repurposed, reshaped. He signed the check with a flourish and tore it from the book. He strode over to the floor manager, Sergio, who looked as though he might faint. Julian handed him the check. "This should cover the bill for every table in the restaurant tonight," Julian said, "with a 25% gratuity for the entire staff, for their patience." It was the closest he could come to a public apology, a grand impersonal gesture to atone for a deeply personal transgression. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. He paused at the door and looked back at Alara, who was still standing by the piano. It was a look that passed between them, alone, an unspoken acknowledgement. The first note of their symphony had been played. Now the difficult work of composition had to begin. She met his gaze, gave another small nod, and then turned to retrieve her personal effects from a service locker. Her time as a ghost was over. 3 months later, the air did not smell of truffle oil and vintage wine, but of old wood soldering flux and Brooklyn rain. The Ethelgard was a distant memory, a prologue to a story that was now being written in a cavernous, neglected recording studio in a quiet corner of Williamsburg. Julian had bought the legendary but defunct Echo Chamber Studios the week after their encounter, not as an acquisition, but as an act of penance and reclamation. The place was a beautiful ruin. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the grimy skylights. The walls were lined with vintage soundproofing that was beginning to decay, and the floor was a tangled jungle of microphone cables. At the center of the main recording hall, where a full orchestra could once sit, stood a single magnificent instrument, a restored 1920s Mason and Hamlin concert. Grand, its tone richer and darker than the Faziolia piano, with a history and a soul. Their new life was a tense harmony. It was not a romance. It was a collaboration, a difficult, often frustrating partnership between two artists from different worlds. Julian had, as promised, made her financial worries disappear. He had set up a trust that paid off her mother's medical debt and provided for her ongoing care, framing it legally as a non-recoupable advance against future royalties from their joint compositions. The phrasing was a legal fiction, but it was a crucial one, allowing Alara to accept the help without sacrificing her dignity. She was no longer his employee or his charity case. She was his creative partner, and she was without question the one in charge. No, not a C-sharp, she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. They were seated together at the piano, the bench barely large enough for two. A mess of sheet music covered in her frantic, decisive scrawls, and his hesitant, rusty notations lay scattered around them. It's too obvious. It resolves the tension too easily. The ghost note has to remain a question here. It needs a flattened fifth. Give me the dissonance. Julian's hands, which could sign away fortunes without a tremor, hovered over the keys with uncertainty. 20 years of neglect had taken their toll. His brilliant technique was buried under layers of corporate rust. His instincts were dull. He was out of practice, and he knew it. The flattened fifth is jarring, he argued, his voice carrying the faint echo of his old autocratic tone. It will alienate the listener. Good. Alara countered, not looking at him, her ear cocked toward the instrument. Let them be alienated. The piece isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's a story about a man who builds a fortress to protect himself from a ghost, only to find out the ghost was locked inside with him the whole time. It should be jarring. He stared at her, a flicker of his old frustration rising. He was Julian Croft. He did not take orders. But then he looked at the music, at the truth in her words, and the frustration subsided, replaced by a grudging respect. She was right. He played the chord with the flattened fifth. The sound was strange, unsettling, and utterly perfectly correct. It was the sound of his own soul. Yes, she whispered, a rare, brilliant smile touching her lips. That's it. That's the sound. In moments like these, the difficult harmony of their partnership resolved into a beautiful, resonant chord. He was the architect, the one with the grand structural vision from his past. She was the builder, the one with the raw practice talent to bring the vision to life. He had the ghost of the melody. She had the voice to make it sing. He was still the CEO of his company, but his presence there had become more spectral. He delegated, he trusted his subordinates, much to their astonishment. He no longer found satisfaction in the bloodless conquest of the market. The real vital work of his life was happening here in this dusty room, in the struggle to resolve a single difficult chord. One rainy afternoon, as they were working, Ilara's phone buzzed. It was her father. She stepped away to take the call, her voice low and warm. Julian couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the sound of the love and relief in her tone, a sound that was as foreign to him as the flattened fifth had been. She hung up and returned to the piano, a serene, peaceful look on her face. My mother is coming home from the rehabilitation center next week, she said quietly. Thank you, Julian. He simply nodded, an uncomfortable warmth spreading in his chest. He had spent his life buying things. This was the first time he had ever truly given something. They worked for months, slowly, painstakingly excavating the symphony from the ruins of his past. They fought, they despaired, they made breakthroughs. They were two broken halves of a single musical idea, slowly learning how to fit together. Finally, one evening, as the sun set over the East River painting the dusty studio in hues of orange and purple, they finished. The final movement, the resolution. The Ghost Note theme returned one last time, no longer a question but an answer. It was a sound of acceptance of a haunting transformed into a partnership of a beautiful, complicated piece. They played the final passage together, 4 hands moving across the 88 keys perfectly in sync. The final chord, a rich and complex C major, filled the hall. It was a sound of arrival, of a long journey finally at its end. They sat in the ringing silence, the vibrations of the final chord washing over them. They were not a billionaire and a waitress. They were not a master and a protege. They were 2 composers seated before the magnificent, difficult truth they had built together. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes held none of his former arrogance, none of his predatory coldness. It held only a profound, bottomless gratitude. "Thank you, Eli," he said, using her real name for the first time. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the fading light. "The pleasure was all mine, Julian." This story serves as a powerful reminder that the greatest talents are often hidden in the most unexpected places, and that a person's worth is never defined by their job title or their bank account. It teaches us that true redemption cannot be bought or sold. It must be earned, often through the difficult work of facing the very parts of ourselves we have tried to bury. The most profound connections are forged not through power or control, but through the shared vulnerability of creating something beautiful together. Thank you for joining us for this journey. If this story of music loss and the rediscovery of the soul resonated with you, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more tales that explore the hidden depths of the human heart, and your support allows us to continue that mission. We are grateful for your time and your attention.